My name is Kaitlyn Stewart, and as my final project for Comp Sci 9638, I have created a simplified summary walking through the components of Dr. Archibald's neurocognitive model of language and executive functions. This model can be overwhelming at first glance, but it holds a lot of value when it comes to understanding the way the brain learns, including the acquisition of language and how it uses what it learns to set goals. Dr. Archibald has created a very thorough video explaining this model in depth in roughly 50 minutes. My goal for this resource was to summarize that original video in simple language and in 20 minutes or less so that it could be easily understood by a clinician or a teacher. Along the way, I will also highlight intervention moments, which are the practical implications of this model for the treatment of children with language disorders. You can also pause this video now and scan the QR code for access to a glossary of key terms that I will use throughout the presentation. The first step to understanding this model will be to understand its major components. This upper portion here can be thought of as representing the brain, the knowledge it contains, and the factors that will affect how it performs with that knowledge. This solid line represents the point at which information is entering the brain. And these lower portions, here and here, represent information from the outside world and information coming from the body itself. This is where we will start our tour of the model. As I just stated, the brain is getting information from two places. The first is from the outside world, from our senses of smell, taste, sight, hearing, and touch. The brain is also receiving information about the state of the body itself, such as signals of pain or hunger, from our kinesthetic and metabolic systems. These signals from our body not only contribute to knowledge in the brain, they can also lead to emotions and motivations. For example, if you are hungry, you might feel angry, and you might be motivated to go get a snack. These emotions and motivations will become important later when we talk about performance factors. The brain can use all this information to form mental representations of things in the environment, meaning it can think about things that haven't actually happened and plan for the hypothetical future. For example, if you see a tree in the park, you can imagine what it might look like in the winter covered in snow. Now, the brain can receive this incoming information in two different ways. The first is using non-volitional attention. In this case, the brain does a little bit of processing and then decides this stimulus can be largely ignored, like the sound of traffic. A type of learning called implicit or procedural learning occurs using non-volitional attention. Implicit learning is the gradual learning of complex information that happens without awareness. Once something has been learned this way, it can be applied quickly and automatically. Think of tying your shoes, for example. Your body figures it out gradually with practice, and once you've mastered it, you don't even have to think about it to do it. We use implicit learning to learn space awareness, which is knowledge of where our body is in space, and time awareness, which gives us an inherent sense of how long things will take. We also use implicit learning for some aspects of language, including our phonological processor, which allows us to discriminate and identify between different speech sounds like k and g, as well as our ability to sequence things, such as sounds in words, words in a sentence, and other non-language related tasks. The brain can also receive information using focused or sustained attention. This allows for explicit learning, which is the active learning of new skills with awareness. This is the type of learning used most in school, and it is how our brain creates our experience-based knowledge network, which has three key components. The first being our episodic memory, which is our memory of our own life events. These memories are richly encoded in the brain, so that when you remember your last birthday, for example, you might also remember the smell of your cake or how happy you were. The more life events we have, the more general knowledge about the world and our culture we will gain, such as how to interact with other people. We will also gain more semantic knowledge, which is our knowledge of concepts and facts, like who the last prime minister was. Our semantic knowledge network has a lot of interconnections, meaning that when we understand a concept like read, we know it comes with certain entailments or prerequisites. For example, we know there must be something to be read and someone doing the reading. This dotted line on the model represents the division between things learned with mostly implicit learning versus those learned with mostly explicit. Intervention moment. One view of developmental language disorders proposes that children with DLD experience a deficit in implicit learning. As a result, this theory suggests that language intervention provided to these children should teach to their strengths by taking advantage of their intact explicit learning. For example, they might need to be explicitly taught the rules for combining sounds in words. Now that we understand the two types of learning, we can look at how oral language is acquired in the brain. This requires us to connect our semantic system, where the meaning of concepts are stored, to units of language, which we call lexemes. Lexemes are any repeating unit that the brain hears often enough and that has meaning. They can be single words like cat, part of a word like step in stepbrother, or a phrase like walk the dog. Lexemes are also mutable, meaning they can be broken down into their constituent parts, and those parts can be rearranged so that the lexeme walk the dog could become walk the cat if one of its parts was substituted. Learning a lexeme requires the brain to know both the phonological realization of the lexeme, aka what it sounds like when spoken aloud, as well as rules about sequencing, which will be related to its semantic entailments. The brain must know how to sequence at the lexeme level by knowing the rules for combining parts of lexemes together. For example, in the lexeme stepbrother, the second constituent part, brother, can be replaced with another subject, as in stepmother or stepcat, but not with a verb, as in step-jump. That doesn't work. The brain must also know what other lexemes can go immediately before and after a lexeme. Finally, the brain must know how to sequence across lexemes, and this becomes important when knowing how to arrange complex lexemes around verbs, such as in the sentence, "The girl with the red dress jumped on the trampoline." In this sentence, the lexeme jumped has the entailment of someone doing the jumping, and the lexeme "the girl with" has the entailment of something to be had. So essentially, as the brain is learning about a concept, it will A, be explicitly learning about its semantic properties and entailments, B, be implicitly learning about the corresponding lexeme for that concept, what it sounds like, and how to sequence it, and C, their brain will also incidentally learn some associated information about the concept unconsciously through implicit learning. Clearly, acquiring oral language relies heavily on both implicit and explicit learning. This brings us to our second intervention moment. Processing oral language clearly puts a large load on the brain's cognitive capacities. This means that for children with DLD, for whom this might require even more cognitive effort than a typically developing child, there are ways educators and SLPs can facilitate a child's understanding of oral language, such as by speaking slowly and clearly, emphasizing the most important parts of their message, checking to make sure the child has understood, and then rephrasing if necessary. There is one last important piece of this model related to oral language, and that is the concept of entrenchment. Entrenchment simply means that a lexeme will become more tightly connected to a semantic concept with more use, making it easier to retrieve. For example, upon hearing the lexeme book, the concept of a paperback novel likely comes to mind quicker than the action of reserving a hotel room, unless you work in tourism. It also means that errors can become entrenched if they are repeated too often. This supports our fourth and fifth intervention moments. When teaching new vocabulary, words will become entrenched best when practice is spread out over time rather than massed all at once, and errorless learning should be encouraged, where supports are in place initially to ensure the child is always responding correctly, and then gradually fading the support as the child achieves mastery. Now that we understand how the brain acquires oral language, we can begin to bring written language into the model. Orthographic knowledge is our knowledge of written letters and symbols, and it is usually learned explicitly. Children are taught the letters of the alphabet as well as how to spell some words. However, with time, the spelling of some highly frequent words will become automatic, which is why this box stretches closer to the dotted line representing implicit learning. Now, we have the three major components of word reading on the model, and we can connect them like so. Here we have the semantic system, which holds our word concepts and is learned explicitly. We have our phonological system, which holds the sound of the lexemes associated with the concepts and is learned implicitly. And we have the orthographic system, which holds knowledge of written letters and is learned both implicitly and explicitly. This results in two separate routes the brain can use to read words. The first is the decoding pathway, which involves the phonological system and the orthographic system and requires individually sounding out each letter in a word. This route is slower, but it is necessary for learning to read new words. It also provides some benefit for the other reading route, which is the sight word pathway. This pathway involves the semantic and orthographic systems and allows us to quickly look up the meaning of a known written word without sounding it out. It's also important to note that both the reading routes in green and the oral language route in blue are bidirectional. This means we can see a written word or hear a spoken word and find its meaning, and we can think of a concept and then find the corresponding written or spoken word. But reading involves more than just word reading. To understand a text, a child must both be able to read the words and comprehend the language. This is called the simple view of reading. Essentially, as a child is reading, They use word recognition and language comprehension to create a situational model of the text in their head. This requires 4 things. First, the brain must activate its prior knowledge from its experience-based knowledge network. This prior knowledge is important for understanding things like story structure, as in knowing a story has a beginning, middle, and an end. Here, this is represented as crystallized intelligence, which is the brain's collection of knowledge and skills acquired over a lifetime, and its ability to use that knowledge. Activating prior knowledge is also necessary for the brain to understand coherence markers, which are used to manage and organize a text. These can occur at a linguistic level or at a text level. For example, in the sentence, "This is Mary, her favorite color is purple," the pronoun her is a coherence marker that the brain must understand refers to Mary. Forming a situational model also involves the brain's thinking skills, which are represented here as fluid intelligence. Fluid intelligence allows the brain to make inferences, which help fill in gaps in a text, as well as to monitor its own understanding of a text, which is a metacognitive skill. The ability to think about its thinking allows the brain to recognize when there is a gap in its situational model so it can go back and reread if necessary. I will make a small aside to note that the process of writing is very cognitively demanding. It requires all the components of this model we've discussed for reading and oral language, while also adding the burden of written transcription. As such, our next intervention moment supports the use of universal design for learning in the classroom, where children are encouraged to use multiple means of expression. Rather than forcing a child to always provide written responses, allowing them to respond in whatever modality best suits their skills will ensure you are truly getting a measure of what they know without the cognitive burden of writing acting as a barrier. We are nearly finished with our tour of the model. There is just one last important piece to cover: performance factors. So far, we've been talking mainly about the knowledge the brain holds, but we also need to consider the factors that impact how we perform with that knowledge. As a reminder, up until now, we've discussed how the brain takes in information from the environment and forms mental representations of these stimuli in the mind. These mental representations let us think hypothetically about things we encounter, and they allow us to label things in our environment, which results in the creation of a language system, as we've been discussing. This ability to think and talk about things hypothetically using language gives us the ability to set goals, which are important for us to know what to do next in life or how to perform with the knowledge we have. Setting goals becomes even more important and complicated when living in a group or society where we need to collaborate with others and balance our personal goals with the group's goals. A key piece to being able to set goals are our executive functions, which we will discuss now. Executive functions are the skills we have that allow us to choose goals, act in line with achieving them, and act insightfully with others. They have 2 key requirements, the first being imagination and flexible thinking. Essentially, we need to think about our mental representations in new and creative ways to imagine alternate outcomes, such as the outcome of landing the job we want. This requires us to have both cognitive flexibility, which is our ability to think of things in new ways, as well as controlled attention, which is our ability to hold ideas in our minds so that we can think about them in the first place. Controlled attention involves both working memory, which can be thought of as the place in our mind where we hold and manipulate information, as well as inhibition, which is our brain's ability to stop attending to irrelevant things. Essentially, working memory keeps relevant ideas in our attention, inhibition keeps irrelevant thoughts out, and cognitive flexibility allows us to think about these ideas creatively. This is our cold cognition. The way our cold cognition is portrayed on this model is important. You can see that all 3 components overlap. This represents the way that all 3 draw from the same pool of cognitive resources, which means that if one is taking too much cognitive effort, it can impact the performance of the others. This brings us to our 6th intervention moment. An environment that places a large demand on inhibition can impair some children's ability to hold ideas in their head and think critically about them. As such, reducing distractions in the classroom or therapy room can help support a child's working memory and cognitive flexibility. This can be done by putting away tempting toys in a therapy room or reducing the amount of content on a worksheet in the classroom so that it is easier for a child to focus on the task at hand. The other key requirement for executive functions and our ability to set goals is to have a sense of self. We need to see ourselves as distinct from others, be able to recognize and understand our own current state, and be able to imagine a hypothetical future state for ourselves. This is what provides our motivation and drive. Think about the last time you wanted to achieve something. You likely envisioned what your future self might look like if you reached that goal, didn't you? This is considered our hot cognition, and it is made up of our motivations, our drive to achieve pleasant outcomes and avoid unpleasant ones, and our emotions, which help us interpret the costs and benefits of our actions. For example, if you were to cheat on a test, you might feel shame or guilt, and these bad feelings show us the cost of our actions and might motivate us to act differently in the future. That's it. Those are all the pieces of the neurocognitive model of language and executive functioning. Now, let's pull it all together and look at how each component works in tandem for goal setting. First, we have information coming in from our body and the outside world that our brain uses to acquire knowledge and make mental representations. We use this information to develop experience-based knowledge about the world, which is important for goal setting. For example, what we know about our culture and the things it values will impact the goals we set, and our knowledge about interacting with others will help us work collaboratively to achieve our goals. We can also attach labels to our mental representations, creating a language system in the process. This language is also critical for setting goals. We need our inner speech to help cheer us on, and we need to be able to use language to communicate with others and persuade them to help us. Finally, we also use this information to develop space and time awareness, which help us know how far beyond ourselves we can extend our goals and how long it will take to achieve them. Then we have our executive functions. Our cold cognition, allowing us to hold relevant ideas in our head and think critically and creatively about them. This ability to think about things in new ways will be constrained by our fluid intelligence, which we described earlier as allowing us to make inferences and think about our own thinking. Fluid intelligence also includes our reasoning, problem solving, and creative thinking, which will contribute to our cognitive flexibility. Our cold cognition will also be influenced by a feedback loop with our hot cognition, aka our motivations and emotions. We need motivation to change in order to begin acting towards a goal in the first place, and we need our emotional responses, like pride or disappointment, to continue to provide motivation as we act. We also need inhibition to manage our emotional responses, so that we don't get too frustrated or upset, especially when working with others. It's important to note that all of the processes and loops in this model will be happening in parallel and at different speeds for different people. And finally, we also need to note the fact that the brain is not acting in isolation. There are things in the environment that will also affect its performance. For example, a child's health, including their sleep, will impact their attention and their ability to learn. The number of experiential opportunities they are exposed to will impact the extent of their world and cultural knowledge, as will the number and type of social relationships they have. And the instructional practices they encounter in their classrooms will also impact their success in acquiring knowledge and achieving their goals. And with that, I hope this video has helped to demonstrate just how complicated of an act it is for a child to acquire and use language, as well as helped you to begin thinking about the ways you can apply this model in the classroom and the therapy room to best support a child's learning. The following are the references I used to create this resource, the primary one being Dr. Archibald's original video explanation. Be sure to check it out on OWL for a more detailed and nuanced explanation of this model.